Welcome to the Center for Secure Free Society's first edition of our new From the Field webinar series. My name is Joseph Humeyer. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Secure Free Society, or SFS as we're known internally. And for those that are new to the center, I like to describe us as a next generation national security think tank that's based here in Washington, D.C., but with a global presence, particularly in Latin America and more recently across the United States. If you're new to this channel, please follow us on social media, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and let me thank you once again for taking part in this initial discussion. The idea for this new From the Field webinar series is to take you to where the action is, on the ground in many of the hotspots worldwide where transnational and transregional threats are emerging and U.S. national security interests are being challenged. For this specific webinar, we're not going to go too far. We're going to go to Texas. In fact, one of the priorities for SFS in 2021 is our new state-based national security program, where we aim to take our geopolitical and global understanding of U.S. national security challenges and take that understanding to local policymakers and officials and authorities in the great state of Texas. I'll actually be taking a trip to Texas soon, but before that, we're going to travel all virtually to Texas to talk with our two distinguished guests. So let me begin by introducing Todd Bensman. Todd is a Texas-based Senior National Security Fellow for the Center for Immigration Studies, another think tank based in the United States. Prior to joining CSIS, he worked for the Texas Department of Public Safety's Intelligence and Counterterrorism Division, where Todd managed teams of intelligence analysts that worked in concert with state and federal officials and the U.S. intelligence community to identify and mitigate terrorism threats often coming along the border. Todd has also over 20 years of experience as an award-winning investigative journalist covering national security topics with a particular focus on immigration. And he is the author of a new best-selling book, which I have right here in front of me, called America's Covert Border War. This is a book that gives you an inside glimpse, inside look into Todd's field research everywhere from the border down to Guatemala to Panama and South America, looking at the migration flows and seeing what actually happens along the border and how these immigration funnels work. One of the topics that we're definitely going to be discussing in a few minutes. Todd, it's great to have you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Now let me introduce our next guest, which is Dr. David Grantham. He's a state-based senior fellow for the Center for Secure Free Society, based in Texas, and contributing author to our Trans-Regional Threats Journal, particularly the Texas series of the journal. Dr. Grantham has also served as a senior fellow of national security at the National Center for Policy Analysis, and before that was a military officer in the United States Air Force and special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, a very elite unit within the United States military. Dr. Grantham holds a Ph.D. from Texas Christian University with specializations in Latin America and Middle East history. And like Todd, is also a new author to a new book called Consequences: An Intelligence Officer's War, chronicling his history deployed to the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, seeing the birth of ISIS, and seeing how border conflicts can erupt in places as far afield as the Middle East, and how that similarity of those same typical threats can manifest themselves closer to the United States. Thank you, David, for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, guys, so basically we're going to go right into it. And I think the topic of the hour, the topic of the day is the border. It's the border crisis. It's the new administration, President Biden's administration's policies on the border. It's everything that's going on in Central America and Mexico, and how this impacts U.S. national security and our relations with our partners further south. So recently, CPB released a new study, or released new statistics, and they say there's been a 28% increase in undocumented migrants that come into the border since the beginning of the year. President Biden's been in office for, say, going on almost 2 months, and he's seen that significant increase where it's been from about 3,000 migrants a day to upwards of 4,500 migrants a day, which I think for many of the border officials constitutes a crisis along the border. There's a capacity problem with the infrastructure at the border. There's obviously a political problem with some of the relations we have with our partners further south. And then there's obviously a security problem that doesn't just include the elements that are coming from Central America, but could include migrants coming from far away as Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. So with all that context, and let me begin first with Todd. How would you describe this humanitarian crisis, the migration crisis at the border? You've been to the border quite a bit. How would you encapsulate it? And also, how would you grade President Biden's immigration policies up until this point?
I would characterize what's happening at the border right now as a major crisis, a mass migration crisis. We're looking at numbers that we rarely see. 100,000 apprehensions just in the month of February that we know of, and probably another 40,000 what are termed gotaways, people that manage to evade Border Patrol and get on into the interior. These are huge numbers. We haven't seen numbers like this since the last migration crisis. I believe that the crisis will escalate sharply from here because we're entering a seasonal, that's normally a cycle of border crossing. And also, I'd point out that having spent a lot of time with migrants, interviewing them in Mexico and Guatemala and coming up over the last year and a half, is that when you speak to them and ask them why they're coming right now, they'll tell you point blank that they're coming to take advantage of the new Biden administration policies of openness and welcome, and that there are now no obstructions like there were during the Trump administration. There's no pushbacks into Mexico. There's policies that would allow them to get it once they're into the country, that they would never be deported either. With that, what you hear from the migrants themselves is that the Biden administration gets an A+ for their immigration policy, for the immigration policies that are in place and the things that they've done. But even before they put policies in place, before Biden was seated, just the campaign rhetoric about what they were going to do back in April, May, June, July, the Democratic primary candidates, was enough to spur very large migration toward the border in anticipation that the border would open up. From a border security perspective, though, if the objective is to not have mass migration, uncontrollable mass migration over the border, then the administration would get a pretty solid F. If there was anything below an F, they would maybe get that. I think we're going to see a very significant, maybe even historic mass migration event over the next few years.
Well, that's a particular strong point, because we've seen mass migration events over the last several years. Actually, the last time the three of us were together in person, I believe, was in February 2019, and that was during the Trump administration. That was coming off the heels of the last migration crisis, which happened during the Central American caravans. Let me go to David to talk a little bit about that. I know, David, you worked a little bit on the caravan issue. You obviously worked the border issues as well. So kind of giving you the same question, how would you encapsulate this border crisis that's going on right now between the U.S. and Mexico? How would you grade President Biden's policies up to this point? And maybe if you could touch a little bit on also what Todd was talking about the misinformation or disinformation, because obviously there's migrants that are probably the most vulnerable in any society that are being lied to by multiple actors all throughout the region, that are telling them that they can get to the United States rather easily, and then there'll be a quick ride into the country. So if you could touch on some of that, be great. Thank you.
The policies could be summed up as saying that the Biden administration is preferring symbolism over substance. We've heard the spokesperson for the White House multiple times say something to the effect of what the Trump administration did was immoral and what we're doing is now moral. And it really clouds when you start measuring your intent and demonizing others' intent based on your version of morality, it really starts distorting the outcomes. So, or at least it doesn't help understand why the outcomes are important. So we're looking at intent rather than outcome. And that, I think, is the biggest problem in terms of understanding the impact of those policies. So if you're measuring intent, then the Biden administration probably gets an A, because they're intending to provide some sort of relief to people that want to come here. When you measure the outcome, obviously, as Todd said, it's absolute failure, because they fail to understand why people are coming. There's a lot of assumptions built into why they're coming, and so understanding that is really important. Distinguishing between intent and outcome, I think, is playing out on the ground right now. Now, when it comes to the issues of the people that are the migrants that are coming, and the fact that they're being lied to, what ends up happening when they come across the border, when they end up here, a lot of these migrants look for work. They need to feed their families, they need to find work, and they have to also do their best to avoid law enforcement to a degree. So what ends up happening is they link up, whether they had a criminal background from where they came from, or whether they're just innocent people looking for work. They generally end up being exploited by the criminal element that's here in the States. The Mexican cartel specifically, they know that these migrants have very few places to turn. Very few will speak English. Very few will understand the American system. And the cartels and other criminal organizations know that. So what ends up happening is they use them and they exploit that vulnerability. So a lot of innocent people are almost double victims. They've been trafficked over the border. They've paid a coyote to get them over the border. And now they end up working for someone else, or they're forced to, or they're in some sort of limbo where they owe money to criminal organizations for work done here locally or coming over the border. So the concern for us here in Texas is the border, but it's also the second and third victimization of these people. And that's when you tie that back into the quote unquote moral thing to do at the border, it really discounts or just completely ignores what happens once they're here. What happens when they've been here for 3, 6, 9 months? What's happening to them after that point is not moral. It's not helpful. It hurts them again. And those are some of the reasons why border security is so important, is to understand the second and third degree issues that come along with border insecurity.
And David, let me stick on that point with you, David, real quick, because one of the things that's often confused me, and I'm sure it's confused some of our viewers, is the difference between a migrant that's coming from Central America or anywhere really for economic reasons, or even for security reasons, because they're fleeing a country that is essentially weak. It hasn't been able to provide these opportunities for these people, and they come to the border because of that reason, as opposed to folks that are fleeing some type of political persecution that would fall under our asylum laws in the United States. Can you distinguish a little bit about that? Because I think there's often a cloudy mixture between the migrants that come from Central America or anywhere, kind of putting them all in one boat. There's those that come for economic reasons, and those are fleeing political persecution, because I believe our asylum laws, at least that were intended to, take care of the latter and not necessarily address the former.
Yeah, let's see if we can unpack this. The asylum laws, or asylum in general, is granted to those who can prove that they meet a criteria that would include things like political persecution or violence, something that tells those in immigration who are evaluating their claims that if I return to where I'm coming from, I will be killed or hurt. And the U.S. grants asylum in different situations for different reasons. So that's the technical and the legal aspect of it. What we're finding, though, as people come to the border, their motivation for coming could be a whole host of things. A lot of times it could be just to take advantage, as Todd said, of lax immigration, and they want to get a job in the United States to send money back. It's more lucrative to work here. What they'll do instead is claim asylum, and they'll create a fake scenario that they're under threat in order to get across the border. So the motivation for them coming here, let's say economic migrants, they're not looking for asylum, but they may use the asylum system in order to successfully come to the United States. Those that don't abuse the asylum system, they just come across the border. A lot of them are merely looking for economic opportunities. What's going to be confusing, though, is Venezuela, as you know, Joseph, Venezuelans have been granted a legal status under asylum. So that will further confuse the issue as we predict that Venezuelans will begin coming north here should these policies continue. And then you have legitimate claims for asylum mixed with other claims for asylum, mixed with fake claims for asylum. And what that does is completely, I'll say dismantled, that's probably too strong a word, but it certainly confuses and could overwhelm a very legitimate system in our asylum process.
That's a good point. We're going to talk about Venezuela in a second, but let me shift over to Todd. And I think one of the most underreported aspects of the border crisis over the years, not just talking about what's going on right now, but over several years during the Trump administration, even going back to the Obama administration, has been this incremental increase in something called SIAs, special interest aliens, as is termed by the Department of Homeland Security. In fact, Todd, I think you're probably exclusively one of the few people that have reported on this with great detail over the last few years, recent years. But before your writing, there was very limited data and things that were publicly available for analysts or others to really want to understand this phenomenon. First, Todd, if you could help us understand what is an SIA according to the Department of Homeland Security, and why is that a concern? Why should we be concerned about that statistic, particularly when it comes to the immigration and border?
So special interest alien is it's government lexicon, formal government jargon, I guess, for which is a labeling that is stamped on the forehead, so to speak, of migrants who are from a list of countries that the intelligence community has come up with. That list changes from year to year. It's ranges anywhere from 25 to 55, somewhere in that. I think right now it's about 30 countries in the Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa, and these are going to be Muslim majority countries. Those are intelligence community assessments that are based on an analysis of what terrorist organizations are present, what kind of local suppression, government suppression activity goes on with them, or how prevalent Islamist ideologies are institutionally in a country and that sort of thing. Because the idea is, if you are somebody coming from one of those countries to the border, then by dint of you being from there, the risk of you being part of an organization or having extremist ideology is higher. It's regarded as a higher threat issue. And so when the label special interest alien gets applied to these migrants, that then triggers a whole array of, it's supposed to anyway, of security vetting for those migrants. Special interest alien, and I should mention though that under the Biden administration, they have now changed the jargon from officially special interest aliens to special interest undocumented non-citizens. So just as for the record, they don't like the term aliens, even in reference to special interest aliens. But this kind of migration pattern has been around for forever. I mean, there have been people migrating over the Atlantic through special smuggling networks that are specialized, and that there are increasing numbers of these migrants that are coming from those countries and actually reaching the border. They travel through South America often, and then sometimes directly to Central America, and then on up through Mexico and to the border. We're talking about, Yemenis and Somalis and people from, all of the countries of the Middle East are able to get here. And not a few of them have turned out to be terrorists and jihadis, as my book is focused on.
So basically, SIAs are irregular migrants that are coming from a collection of countries in Middle East, Africa, and South Asia that have a high density of terrorist presence. Something that I think is probably not something that any one administration has been targeting. Is basically a collection of state policy through multiple administrations, because the terrorist problem has been perpetuating for a long time. But in that, let's take one of those countries, for instance, one that I'm familiar with, which is Iran, right? Iran is on the SIA list, or what I guess is a special interest in undocumented migrant.
On the country of interest list, yes.
Country of interest list. And recently there was an apprehension, I think, in the Yuma sector of the border with Arizona, where there was 11 Iranian migrants that passed by. So when you were working as a Texas official, a Texas counterterrorism official, looking at the border, was this something that was already happening back then? If so, can you, without obviously talking about anything that's sensitive, but can you talk a little bit about what is the SIA presence at the border then, and how does that look compared to now? Is this something that's growing, is increasing, and are there actual potential or suspected terrorists moving through these channels?
Yeah, so this system that I described of the intelligence community building these lists, and if you're from one of those countries on the list, you are a special interest alien, and that triggers certain kinds of security vetting activity. That has been in place for about 13 years now, 14, 15 years now. And it was a post 9/11 protocol. It was created out of the 2002 and 2003 legislation, kind of revamping our domestic security apparatus, creating DHS. And one of the things that required was that our border control agencies deal with that problem. And this is how they deal with it. When by the time I got to Texas Department of Public Safety, this was already well established. These protocols were well established, and typically what it looks like is, especially for example, Iranians is a good example. When Iranians hit the border, the bell dings, and the three-letter agencies, representatives of the three-letter agencies, rush down to the border facility, where the detention facility where they are, and will begin conducting hours and hours of face-to-face interviews, looking for signs of deception, looking for signs that maybe they're part of something, that they have training in counter interviewing techniques, or that they may have something in their cell phones which are dumped, their pocket trash, that sort of thing. And that goes on all the time under all administrations, Democrats and Republicans alike. It doesn't really matter. They all do it. The Biden administration will be happening under the Biden administration as well. The Iranians, I might add, are usually not considered a threat of that they're going to conduct attacks or something like that. More so for Iranians, that because they're state-controlled actors, even Hezbollah, that it might be it might be intelligence or intelligence agents trying to kind of get into the country under the rubric of I'm a migrant looking for asylum.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think not all the threats are necessarily just the concern that a jihadist is going to come and engage in some type of terrorist attack. I mean, there's facilitators, there's intelligence operatives, there's all kinds of other different kind of threat actors that I think could be abusing the same system.
I will say that I've interviewed quite a few Iranians myself in my official capacity with the state, and One of them, for example, was a member, claimed he was a member of the Ayatollah's personal bodyguard, and about a third of that force was purged over something. And so that was a very interesting case. That was somebody who might very well have had information that would help American intelligence.
Absolutely. And actually, just to kind of validate what you're saying, Todd, my own experiences going to Guatemala specifically, I remember this was around the period of the Caravans back in 2018. I remember that there was, prior to that episode in the mass caravans, I think it was October 2018, it was earlier that year, that they had an influx of SIAs, particularly from Bangladesh, that were coming into the country and moving north. But it was interesting because 5 of these individuals that had claimed they were from Bangladesh, because obviously they all come without papers, they have no identifying documents. Because it's on this targeted country list, they had the additional screening that was carried in conjunction with U.S. immigration officials, ICE in particular. They were able to discover that they weren't Bangladesh, they were actually Palestinian. And this was a particular alert because Guatemala had just, prior to that, moved its embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and was under a kind of state of alert because of that. So if it wasn't for the fact that they were on that targeted list, and it wasn't for the fact that we had extra additional screening measures to identify that they weren't where they said they were from, that could have ended up pretty poorly, not just for the Guatemalans or for anyone really that might have been in along that path. So that's a very important program. Let me pivot over to David now, and to talk about something you were talking about a second ago, David, about Venezuela. Because when we talk about the border, we talk about immigration, Venezuela is obviously not mentioned in a lot of those conversations. But some of the things that we worked on the center, and me and David have worked on collaboratively, has been looking at the Venezuela crisis and looking at different elements of how that crisis affects U.S. national security, in particular Texas. But one element that I think that you touched on in your remarks, like you'd expand on this a little bit, is up until now, the Venezuelan migrants, which, let's say, this is the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere, the second largest in the world. We're talking about 5.5 million migrants and refugees that have left the country of Venezuela since 2014. But they've mostly been moving south. So they've been a problem for South America. They've been a problem for Colombia, for Ecuador, for Peru, for Chile. And I say problem not in the context, not in the negative context, because obviously a lot of these countries are welcoming, and we understand the very bad situation that is in Venezuela. But I say problem in the sense that it's a capacity problem, just like anything else. They don't have the infrastructure, the resources to deal with that level of migration. Many of these South American countries are now becoming much stricter with their immigration enforcement, particularly when it comes to Venezuelan migrants, because they just can't withhold. They don't have the capacity to deal with this. Some of them are starting to shut their borders to this, which would naturally incentivize those same migrants to start to push north. What kind of scenario are we talking about if that happened? Can that actually happen? Obviously, traveling north is much more difficult. It's not land traversed. You have to go through the Darien Gap in Panama. You have to maybe go through small boats into Costa Rica or Nicaragua. But what is that? Paint that scenario for us. You mentioned it. I think it's a very important point, something that's not discussed currently, but couldn't be discussed later, especially as these two migration phenomena, Central America and Venezuela, potentially connect.
Yeah, like you mentioned, the countries in South America are overwhelmed with trying to help fleeing Venezuelans. That, like anything else, when you have that proverbial water hose and you squeeze one in, that water's got to go somewhere. And with the Venezuelans that are going to continue to leave Venezuela as situation worsens there, you can expect more and more people are going to begin looking north. It's only logical when countries down there begin closing their doors because they just don't have the infrastructure to sustain such a large number of people. They're going to have to find somewhere else to go. And on top of your 5.5 million that have already left since 2014, estimates now in Latin America are looking at anywhere from 8 to 9, that number jumping to 8 to 9 million within the next 2 to 3 years, or maybe earlier. I can't imagine that number, 8 to 9 million, is going to be able to remain in South America. That's going to have to go somewhere. So as you mentioned, there are enormous struggles with trying to cross from Colombia to Panama and then going through Central America, much more difficult than those who are already in Central America and just moving up through Mexico. But desperation will breed innovation, and I can only imagine the different ways that they will find to get around that gap. And that's just natural. That's human nature to find a way. My concern really comes more with the Maduro regime and his cohorts in supporters in Cuba, in Central America, who will likely exploit those movements going north. We remember Cuba and the boat lift when Fidel Castro saw people leaving, and he said, fine, if you want to leave, I'll send a bunch with you. And he flooded southern Florida with all kinds of, he essentially emptied the jails. That kind of thing could very well happen with Maduro. He doesn't care about the Venezuelan people. That's not his concern. His concern is power. His concern is keeping his drug networks operating, keeping them lucrative, and staying in touch with Fidel Castro or with Raul Castro and with Iran. So those people become a object of his, or they feed into his objectives. And we could expect, should they begin to move north, should the numbers expand to 8-9 million, like many experts in Latin America are predicting, I firmly believe Maduro will take advantage of that. And any number of things can happen, but we call it the weaponization of the needy, forced migration. You could very well see caravans with people, legitimate people looking for asylum who have been granted asylum under U.S. law. Maduro could very well embed people in there or manipulate those caravans to overwhelm specific sectors of the U.S. border so that he can then use his networks to move drugs over the border, et cetera. So we can go through all the scenarios. There's a bunch of them, but I think the key to understanding the Venezuelan crisis is that those numbers can't be sustained in South America. That there's a high probability they would be moving north. And then what happens is regimes like Maduro will then take advantage of this mass migration, this forced migration, and then open up his playbook really to how he can manipulate the situation to continue his goals of asymmetric warfare against the United States.
Yeah, I think that's the linchpin to what you're saying, and maybe like the key country would be Mexico. I think in that scenario, because obviously Mexico is a partner of the United States both in trade and with immigration and with national security. But the current government of Mexico, and I'm referring to the government of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has kind of a wishy-washy relationship with Washington. It's good on some levels, and then on some levels, he tends to flirt with some of the same adversaries of the United States, particularly the regime in Venezuela. So where do you see Mexico fit to this situation? I think that's particularly important for Texas, being the direct neighbor to Mexico. Where do you see AMLO positioning himself on this type of, knowing that he has close relationships with some of these governments that are a bit more adversarial to the United States, and knowing also that he has his own immigration problems because he has his own border with Guatemala, for instance, that he has to contain because he doesn't want to have the same issues in his country that some of these other countries have already experienced?
Well, when I look at the strategic level, at the political ideology, what we see is an AMLO administration that leans toward the nationalization policies, he's light socialist policies, and that he has an affinity for those things. Those are reflected in a more extreme example in the Maduro regime and in others, the Fernandez government in Argentina. There's a rise of this socialist leaning policies in Latin America in several countries. So that alone causes concern because his affinity is toward those things. Now, logistically, Whether those relationships blossom, obviously we'll wait to see. But just that affinity alone tells me that AMLO will remain wishy-washy, as you say, toward the United States, and likely be very coy about his relationships with Maduro. We already know, and we published a report in one of our articles in the Texas-based program, walking through AMLO's concerning relationships with Cuba, with Venezuela, with the Fernandez government in Argentina. And those relationships were of concern because he wouldn't condemn Maduro. He wouldn't side with countries in Latin America that are looking for a peaceful transition of power so the Venezuelan people can return to their lives. He didn't support those, or at least didn't support that openly. Moreover, there was concerns with oil relationships with the Maduro regime. There was oil coming into Mexico that couldn't be explained outside of its relationship with Venezuela. More concerning, and on a more granular level, is we have to take into note the cartels. The Mexican cartels have enormous influence in Mexico, and what that situation alone could become the primary issue, because the networks that Maduro relies on to move cocaine. Now we know the Department of Justice has already issued affidavits and complaints throughout 2020 outlining the Maduro regime's, the cartel of the suns, as they call it, and their activity moving cocaine into the United States for the express purpose of damaging American communities through addiction and violence. And in order for them to do that, in order for the Maduro regime to do that, they need the Mexican cartels to move that cocaine. They are an integral part of the network for Maduro, and that's where Maduro receives much of their revenue and how they stay in power. So I'd say the ideological issue is of concern, and it helps predict which ways AMLO will go. But we also have to watch those granular, maybe granular is too light a word to describe the Mexican cartels, but we do have to see how their influence and how they fracture, how they coalesce. All of that will tell us better how AMLO is going to respond on a nation-to-nation issue with Maduro, because the the cocaine is so important to sustaining the Maduro regime.
That's a good point. I think, Latin America oftentimes doesn't get its due attention when it comes to these kind of threats that are converging, both with drug trafficking and with terrorism and with immigration, and obviously the geopolitical complexities of the different governments and the political actors in the region. But let me bring this back to the border. Let me go to Todd. And Todd, let me get a chance to talk to you a bit about your book. This is, I think, a well-timed book, to be honest with you. I mean, it really comes at a much-needed time when I think a lot of Americans are very concerned about what's happening with the border. There may be some concern. Some of them are concerned about the current administration's policies on the border. Now, you've spent a lot of time, not just at the border, but as they say, immigration is multi-layers, at the countries that go further south of the border. A lot of that's chronicled in your book on America's covert border war. So tell us a little bit about what inspires you to write it, what's the most significant details that are in it, and what is the message that you like to convey, both to the policymakers here in Washington, but also just to the general public in the United States, who I think, and Latin America, I should say, that I think are all really looking at these border conflicts and border skirmishes that are increasingly part of this geopolitical puzzle. So tell us a bit about your book, Todd.
Sure. Well, I used to be a newspaper reporter, 23 years as a journalist, and my last major stint as a reporter was down on the border, San Antonio. In about 2006, 2007, I showed up there, and I'd heard rumors that Iraqis were crossing, and people from we were at war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Afghanis were coming over the border. And every time I asked anybody familiar with the border about that, people would just laugh me off. that that's just not true, none of that's true or whatever, until finally I was able to find out for myself where some Iraqis were that actually had done it. And so I met the Iraqi, a particular one, and started to do a lot of reporting based on that Iraqi story and introductions to other Iraqis that were coming across. And I ended up writing about it way back then. But the thing about the whole issue of that Iraqis could come, and if good ones who are persecuted, who need our protection can come, then so can the bad one. The bad ones is that it was regarded as like some kind of fringe conspiracy crazy talk. Nobody, I think even to this day, it's sort of the topic of that is, people furrow their eyebrows and roll their eyes at it. And we saw that happen again a year and a half or so ago when Donald Trump brought it up in connection to the Caravans, that there were Middle Easterners coming through. He said he'd seen intelligence about Middle Easterners coming through. And the national media just ferociously pushed back and said none of that was true. There is no migration. There is no Middle Easterners. It was the same thing that I was hearing back then. So I decided that, and of course, this also came after about a decade of me working with those migrants as an intelligence official and seeing all of the federal agencies deeply involved in the issue with official programs, counterterrorism programs. So when I saw the media push back and the nation pretty much kind of go away saying, yeah, it's just a crazy talk, I thought that there was a need for a book like this that once and for all just resolved all of the issues that come up as a fight every time the question of whether jihadists can cross the border comes up. So I kind of view my book, America's Covert Border War, as a reference guide, a Webster's dictionary to this issue. It's nonpartisan. I take shots at Republicans who have over the years exaggerated the threat and Democrats that have underplayed the threat. That, like in the media, saying that there is no migration from these countries. There is migration from those countries. And furthermore, the book really takes a lot of pains to document what it is that the United States Homeland Security apparatus is doing about it, these official programs by all these different agencies that have been doing counterterrorism that are focused on special interest aliens for years and years, and what they think about this. Never mind what Donald Trump thinks about this, but these are professional practitioners, careerists. They're not political appointees. They work on these issues day in and day out, and they perceive that there is this threat. So the book really kind of takes their point of view, as well as how it works from the smuggling point of view, how they actually are able to move through, and who gets caught, who has been caught up in these nets over the many years. And I think the president was correct when he originally said, and everybody jumped on him, that there are jihadists that have come through, that do come through, and have been caught.
No, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Todd, when you said there's equally these two wrong reactions to this kind of problem set, right? There's folks that underestimate the whole thing and say, well, that's ridiculous if you were to say that there's Middle Easterners coming through Central America up into the border, when that's clearly documented. I think you've done a lot of the great work documented, but the intelligence community has this information. And I think it's very feasible that if you're the president of the United States, you have access to that information and you can understand that. But there's equally, I think, been charged rhetoric that over-exaggerates these things. And I think that the key to that is the nuance. And I think that that's from the conversations that we've had, Todd, over the years, and the writings that you've published that I've been able to read, including those that are now in the book. I think what I particularly like is how you document things. You document things not just by reading what's on the internet, but you actually go to these countries, you interview the migrants, you talk to local officials, you get documents from these officials, and you analyze everything. And a lot of that's in this book. So I highly recommend everybody to purchase this book, available on Amazon. It has probably some of the most insightful firsthand accounts of what's going on with our immigration all throughout Latin America up into the border, and how that migration chain kind of evolves and can be abused by nefarious actors that are looking to basically sneak illicit actors into the United States, which is not an exaggeration per se. It's a documented fact, that I think that's something that our local immigration authorities are having to deal with. Let me now go to David, and David's book's a bit different. David's book's not about necessarily the immigration problem, the Biden or the border crisis, but it definitely is about these threat networks, and is about the firsthand account of somebody that served in a combat theater, in this case David, when he was with the Air Force, and serving in a very particular specialized unit. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations isn't probably the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to counterterrorism for most of your viewing public. There isn't like a movies about it. There isn't TV shows documenting about it. But it's an interesting unit. I've encountered some of the Air Force OSI guys when I was in Iraq, because they have equal military authority because they're part of the Air Force, but they have law enforcement authorities. I believe you guys are trained at the Flat Sea in Georgia, and so you guys are also credentialed law enforcement officers, which is very unique for a military officer to have that type of credential. And what your book, I think, does is it chronicles what that kind of capability means in a combat zone where you're dealing with terrorists. So tell us a little bit about your book, David. Same as Todd, tell us what inspired you to write it, and what's the message you like to get to the public and the policy world about your book, Consequences: An Intelligence Officer's War.
What I found when I'm looking for intelligence books to understand intelligence operators, understand how they do what they do, and what can I learn from them. What I often found was it was an extraordinary person in an extraordinary situation. It would be someone who I would never be the head of some super secret unit within the CIA. And you end up, everything becomes more of a movie reel, famous people doing these incredible things. And what I found with sharing my story with people was they found it interesting, even though it wasn't a James Bond level story. They found it interesting, and what they found was it was actually extraordinary to them, even though I was an ordinary guy. And so what really inspired me to begin writing it was just that, taking an ordinary guy and showing how I was put in an extraordinary situation and in an extraordinary job. That's really what inspired the story, and what inspired me to write the book was feedback on other books that I had been featured in, sharing my story. And then, frankly, I just had a publisher approach me and said, I'd love for you to consider writing a book about the Air Force Office of Special Investigation. As you said, few people even know about it. Moreover, few people even know of the counterintelligence function within OSI. And so those two things, the feedback I received on existing stories when I was deployed, and then the fact that really no one knows about OSI, prompted me to sit down and write my story, particularly about my first deployment in 2006, where I bounced around the area of responsibility, the AOR, as we say in military terms. And for the most of my tour, I ended up in southern Iraq, where I was stationed at Camp Bucca. And Camp Bucca was famous now for where ISIS really got started. Al-Baghdadi, who ran ISIS before his death, he was interned at Camp Bucca along with several different high-ranking ISIS officials and members. And when I began telling stories of going, yeah, I was at Camp Bucca, we collected intelligence on these guys, but we obviously didn't know back then in 2006 that they would become ISIS in 2014. But when the news started breaking about this group and these members that served time at Camp Bucca, my mind, all these stories started coming forward, helping me put into context everything that we knew back then and helping understand how ISIS developed. And so in the course of writing the book, I was telling a story about here's how an ordinary guy who was put into the intelligence community operates in a deployed environment with an organization you probably never heard of. Well, I started writing the book. I said, wow, the story is actually pretty extraordinary. We were there when one of the worst terrorist organizations came to life, or we were, as I say in the book, Camp Bucca was kind of the wet nurse to ISIS. It didn't form it, but it certainly got it to a strong, healthy place. And so coupled with all that, writing the story became fairly easy and fun. And I did write it in a way that it reads like fiction. I wanted the reader to be there with me. I wanted them to hear the conversations we had. I wanted them to get inside my head. What was going on as a young intelligence officer during one of the most difficult parts of the Iraq War? I mean, mind you, this is before the surge. So the violence was really unparalleled up to that point. And then we killed the U.S. airstrike against Zarqawi was carried out while I was there. And so that kind of added to the story of how things happened when I was deployed. But really, at the end of the day, what really got me to writing this book, and what I'm most proud of, is to be able to share my story, but also share how intelligence officers operate on the ground and how important it is to know what's happening on the ground in order to forecast what's going to happen in the future. Just my story alone, I'm able to pull threads from ISIS, pull threads from Iran's threat to the United States, pull threads on the border. Iran was moving over the Iran-Iraq border constantly. There's so many parallels, so many policy solutions that can be found just in my story of being an intelligence officer on the ground. And it's a fun read.
No, yeah, I have to agree with that. I think David's book, which I recommend everybody buy, available also on Amazon, called Consequences: An Intelligence Officer's War, it reads like a novel. It reads like a story. It's not necessarily like a policy, a dense book that deals with a lot of the facts and the figures. It has some of that, but it's also kind of a personal story, and I enjoy that very much. And I would say that to that point, I mean, this is kind of from my personal experience. I think my time in the Middle East, both as a military NCO and then also as a civilian later, it helped me understand Latin America. I know that's going to sound weird for many people in the audience, but the Middle East and Latin America have some things that they share in common, not just the SIA migration patterns, but also just kind of the way these two regions have struggled to basically evolve past these economic and political and democratic challenges and to move forward. And I think right now, both of these regions are very heavily impacted negatively by the coronavirus, by the local governments that are taking the regions towards more conflict and chaos. With that, we're approaching the end of the webinar. And what I want to do is ask one question to both of you to kind of wrap this up. And if you could be concise in your response. But I think at the end of the day, we have all these conversations about the border, about President Biden's policies. But what would be the policy solution if you could be king for a day, right? If it was Todd and David together, you guys can have a policy of your choosing to help correct this crisis at the border. What would be that policy solution? So let me go first to Todd, and then we'll go to David, and then we'll wrap up. So go ahead, Todd.
Well, first of all, we have to understand that when you have mass migration, high volumes of people coming over any border, you collapse the control systems, the management systems for that border, and make it more vulnerable to bad actors, to operatives from very far away. My chapter 1 of America's Covert Border War is entirely devoted to what happened in Europe, which was a mass migration in 2015, broke down all the border controls, and you had ISIS operatives purposefully deployed among the migrants to get in to conduct the Paris and Brussels attacks Those were all done by operatives who were sent there among migrants, camouflaged over borders. And for the last 6 years, has been one terror attack after another by other migrants who have crossed in over those borders as well, mainly because the normal systems broke down. And I would apply that to right now, the American southern border, which we are seeing collapse as we speak. And I think over the next coming months and years, we'll just have a kind of an unmitigated problem down there with our normal systems broken down. Within those systems are these covert border war programs that I talk about in the book. And I'm very worried that those are going to break down too, just like the ones in Europe, and that our risk is much elevated. In the book, I talk about the Democratic appointee to DHS, Jay Johnson. His name is Jay Johnson, for the Obama administration. And in the last months of 2016 of the Obama administration, Jay Johnson called together all of the top heads of all of his DHS agencies for the purpose of revamping the special interest alien programs, these covert border wars. He ordered all of them to get on the same page, to put the vehicle up on the floor and look under and figure out what was wrong and fix it. That was a process that was very well underway when the Trump administration took office and never advanced beyond that. And so my number one recommendation in the book is to bring back the Obama Jay Johnson plan for special interest alien interdiction and disruption and suppression, and revisit the whole thing and make sure that it doesn't get discarded in this mass migration that we're about to experience now. And I also would point out that the fact that it was a Democrat that took special interest alien traffic and the threat so seriously that they would implement a massive program like this, which I lay out in great detail in chapter 2 of the book, shows just how bipartisan this whole issue really is and ought to be.
Absolutely. This is certainly a bipartisan issue. National security in general should always remain bipartisan. Obviously, that's increasingly difficult in a politicized environment. But I thank you again for reminding us of that. That's a very important point. And so, David, what would be your policy of the day if you were king of the day to be able to help alleviate or fix some of our problems we're having at the border?
Well, I love the quote that if I was given a problem, if I was given an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend the first 50 minutes asking questions. And really, I would begin to say, what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve border security, right? How do we achieve that? At the moment, we need to de-incentivize reasons for coming. And how we de-incentivize is going to be making it harder to come over the border. There's a number of ways you can do that. And I think Trump was onto something with policies that said, if you come here and you're seeking asylum, you will not be able to come to the United States while we're processing that, or certain claims of asylum that didn't meet certain criteria. It pretty much said you can come to the border, but you're not going to be able to get in unless you have, the checklist of things. Whereas now, most anyone feels like they can get across the border. So the first thing would be re-implementing strategies that I think Todd touched on with the Obama administration and the Trump administration, where they de-incentivize reasons for coming. And that could be merely just turning the clock back just a bit, strengthening certain policies that won't allow for incentivizing people to come. That would be the first. After that, then you can address issues such as the wall. I don't necessarily think there's a need for a wall across the whole border, but there are certain paths that are well-worn paths of smugglers that can be identified, and then we can begin to leverage resources, whether it's a wall, whether it's technology, to begin stemming the tide in those very specific corridors that are well known to the intelligence community. So I would start with programs that would de-incentivize people to come, and then after that, begin looking at isolating those problem areas and addressing them immediately.
Well, from your mouth to the policymakers' ears, I think these are very good suggestions. I'll just conclude by saying that, I spent a decade or more looking at Latin America, and I think that at the core of everything that we're going to be facing when it comes to immigration, but also a multitude of other kind of threats, drug trafficking and others, that we have to get very serious about our Latin America strategy because Latin America is in a very precarious situation, not just because of the coronavirus, but because of political forces that are present in the region. And the last thing that we can afford is to have a Latin America that looks more and more like the Middle East, because obviously we've seen what the Middle East has done to neighboring regions, Europe, and including in the issue of migration. And that could easily happen here in the Western Hemisphere. So let me conclude by thanking both Todd Bensman, Senior Fellow for the Center for Immigration Studies, author of the new best-selling book, America's Covert Border War, as well as our Senior Fellow from SFS, David Grantham, who is the author of Consequences: An Intelligence Officer's War. Both excellent books, excellent conversation. Let me thank you again for joining us on our first edition of the From the Field webinar series. Let me thank the audience for taking part. If you're new to our channel, if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're watching us on Facebook, be sure to hit the like button and get more notifications about future editions and future issues of the From the Field webinar series that we'll be publishing more frequently. Let me also take the opportunity to promote a publication that David is authoring in our Texas series of the Trans-Regional Threats Journal. We have the first issue already out for 2021 that dealt with the weaponizing of networks from Venezuela into the United States, and particularly how this affects the Lone Star State of Texas. The second issue will be out shortly, and then we have a third issue. This is part of a three-part series, so be on the lookout for our Trans-Regional Threats Journal Texas series. And then lastly, I invite everybody to go to our website, www.securefreesociety.org, to get all the updates on the latest publications, research, and analysis from the Center for a Secure Free Society. And with that, let me thank you once again, thank our speakers, thank the audience, and we'll keep you informed of the next From the Field webinar. Thank you once again.